Well, I want to congratulate you on the journey. You've made it to the final unit of this class, so you're just a couple of steps away from having survived the semester and completed Religion 102. Now, as we approach the study this week, there's a couple of things I want to make sure that you're aware of. The book that we're studying is, in ancient times and in our own, one of the most contentious in the New Testament scriptures, and also the one with perhaps the most troubling history of interpretation or misinterpretation. And of course, I'm talking about the book of Revelation. This book, which is often erroneously referred to as Revelations, it's not, it's singular, not plural, has been popularized in so many different ways, and certainly, perhaps most recently in the series Left Behind, where it was sort of sensationalized as what it's going to be, and that, of course, has to do with one particular viewpoint on the book. But everybody kind of comes to this, it's a vision of gloom and doom and the end, and it both is and isn't that. So to give you a couple of keys to help you as you look through Revelation this week, I think it's important to talk about it as a work in its genre. Just like the Gospels are a genre of literature and the epistles, and all of them have different genre conventions and common features, this book belongs in a genre of literature as well, although it's the only book of its type, and the only book of its genre in our New Testament library. The type is called apocalyptic. And apocalyptic is a form of writing that appears in different kinds of religious traditions, but this one distinctively draws from the Jewish tradition and the early Christian traditions as well. There are two apocalyptic books in the entirety of the Christian Bible. One is in the Old Testament, and it's the second half of the book of Daniel. And, of course, what we have here. We do have some other elements of apocalypticism. Jesus himself, in all of his teachings, with the exception of the Gospel of John, has a small apocalyptic section where he talks about troubles that are to come and the need for faithfulness to counter internal laxity within the community of faith and external pressure applied to the believers to get them to abandon the way of faithfulness in a difficult time. Of course, there's warnings and such not to do that, and there are predictions of ultimate things. So this is a book that does deal in some senses with eschatology, and if you remember, that's the eschaton is the last things or the final things. So this does have to do with the terminus, the ultimate endpoint of what God has been up to in the story of the Bible. But it's also kind of, in a sense, kind of coded in a way into the genre of apocalypticism. Apocalyptic has a couple of interesting features. It always serves to ground present faithfulness on the basis of a future hope that is soon to be realized. All of them emerge in times of great trouble for a given community. In particular, there are some other apocalyptic works of the period. You could look at Second Enoch or Fourth Esdras or some of the other books, that Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, that appear, if you're interested in researching these things, that are excluded, and with good reason, from our biblical canon. There are some interesting things that kind of continue to develop theme-wise throughout all of these works. There's sort of an evil opposition against the faithful remnant. The faithful remnant hangs on to its faith in response to internal laxity, so a temptation to quit because things are tough, and external pressure on the community. And these books are designed to give people the faith and the strength to kind of endure this difficult time due to a certain deliverance that's yet to be realized, that's coming on its way. Now, a genre convention of this type of literature is that these things are happening soon. And of course, we've already explored how the early Christian understanding of the parousia, of the second coming of Christ and the eternal judgment and things of that nature, the soon was adjusted from an imminent parousia to a more, I guess we would say, loose understanding of soon. When we come to read this particular work of literature, like other apocalyptic works, we have to make some decisions. There is one model of interpretation, which some people refer to as a preterist model, which says that all of these things were referring to events that were contemporary to the writer. So this book is written somewhere between 68 and 90, probably a little later rather than a little earlier in the first century. So between 68 and 90, all of these events have to do with things that were going on that were contemporary to the writer and the first audience of readers. And they don't really have any ongoing relevance other than just what we can learn from their past experience. There's another model of interpretation that has a futurist orientation. So this is somebody who's And a good contemporary example, and I hope you don't know who this is, but if you've ever been subjected to this on TV, a guy named Hal Lindsey, who's a prophecy preacher, or so he claims, would read Revelation in one hand and the newspaper in the other, and find correlations between things that are happening. Oh, there's earthquakes, there's wars in the Middle East, so it's rumors and rumors of wars, there's earthquakes, and they try to correlate these events with things that are happening that are completely contemporary with the reader. So basically it says for the last 2,000 years of Christian history and Christian interpretation, this book is largely invalid for people in the fast, because we're certainly now in our present times in the end times. So we're looking for things that correlate with the events that happen here and the predictions and prophecies here. And of course this also reduces prophecy to the narrowest possible definition of that, which is simply just prediction. So those are some kind of tensions that people have. In terms of the lecture and the material and how I would encourage you to consider this book, is this book, which is very confusing. It's wrought with a lot of unusual symbolism. It has continued to be important for Christians from the first centuries to now, not because it was just something that happened in the first century or because it's something that's entirely future oriented, but because it has a present truth value that continues to speak to people's present experience when it's understood correctly. This isn't a linear history. We're not trying to reduce the ultimate vision of what God is up to a divine train schedule and try to figure out when it's all going to happen. Every time somebody has done that, it's been kind of disastrous, and it's of course been completely wrong. There have been a lot of movements throughout history, from William Miller, who was an 18th century Baptist preacher who first kind of popularized the language that we see in stuff like Left Behind today, like the idea of the rapture, that the believers would be sucked out and kind of given a free pass to not go through the really, really bad things at the end. It was, in the 18th century, he had gathered these followers in Britain, and they were waiting, as the ones who believed, they were kind of given the free pass, so they were waiting on his calculations of when it was going to be and when Jesus would return to collect them. And of course they were disappointed a couple of different times. While his movement fell apart, it later went on to form the roots of what would become Seventh-day Adventism. So there's an interesting connection with certain kinds of apocalyptic and eschatological perceptions that go along with groups like that. A little more contemporary to our time, if you remember a couple of years ago, a guy named Harold Camping, who was some kind of like radio Bible pastor, had kind of convinced his followers that it was all going to happen. So a lot of them had quit their jobs and had sold their goods and had kind of gathered to await this coming. As the faithful few who knew about it, they were given the free pass, which, if you notice, when people tend to reduce that, and of course they were also disappointed a couple times, and it's not that his system of interpretation was wrong, it's just his math was wrong. If you notice that that's a consistent theme. So there is a tragic history of misinterpretation and misappropriation of this book. When people try to harden it into, oh, it's happening now, so we need to do this, they're kind of missing the point when they reduce it to a train schedule and we need to make sure we catch the train. What Revelation does, in fact, offer is a vision. It helps us to understand the meaning of the title. We translate it as revelation, and that's from the Greek word apocalypsis. Apocalypsis essentially means unveiling. So let's imagine that we are at a fancy art party. So pinkies up, because the higher your pinky, the fancier you are. That's what SpongeBob taught me about etiquette, and I think that's a good rule. So we're all at a fancy art party. And we're waiting on a statue that nobody has ever seen, that a master artist has created, to be unveiled. So right now it's covered in a black cloth while we're enjoying our caviar and hors d'oeuvres and things of that nature. And then the statue is unveiled, and everybody can see the master work that had been concealed. Now, the statue had been in the room for the entirety of the party, but nobody had seen it until it was unveiled. That's the exact meaning of the Greek word. When we hear apocalypse, we either think of a really kind of terrifying X-Men villain, or we think about the end of all things. It's gloom and doom. What the word actually means, though, is to remove a veil so that what has been present all along can be seen clearly by everyone in the room. So it's an unveiling. When we understand that this is what this book is purporting to be, and it's symbolic, it's visionary, in the sense of it's given in visions, and John, or the author, literally distills those down into the account that we have, it really helps us to understand that that was his goal. That what he's trying to say is, The victory of God through Jesus is already realized. It's already happened in heaven, and the implications of that are playing out into the rest of reality until they reach their fruition, which is essentially the making right and the making new of all things at the ultimate return of Christ through an act of final judgment. So all of that is here. It's really, truly there. But it's a story of redemption, and it's also a story that purports to reveal what has already happened, what has been in the room, what has taken place all along, and be kind of throwing back the curtain so people can see from a different perspective what's really happening. When we understand that that is the goal of the writer, rather than to give us a timetable or a train schedule of when the J train is coming to town and we hope that we're on it, it's really trying to help believers in their circumstance understand history in a sense as cyclical, that these kinds of things, and this is true of most apocalyptic texts, when it talks about these things happening soon, like the beast opposing the prophets and then the suffering of the saints and the martyrs, those things are happening all the time. So there is a shift in early Christian understanding that we sometimes miss because of the influence of systems of eschatology that we've been exposed to. And the shift is simply this, that ever since Jesus rose from the dead and was vindicated as the Messiah, that is in fact the end time. So it's a final age of humanity before a sweeping act of judgment and redemption and all things are made new. Or to use the phrase that biblical scholar N.T. Wright uses, that everything is at last put to rights, so things are made ultimately as they ought to be in a new creation, which is the goal. And that's really what Revelation takes us to, is through what has been going on for believers in more or less intense periods up until the ultimate end point of what God has been driving the bus to. So when we understand that this is revealing a hidden hope that can help people hold on and give some kind of window into what they're ultimately looking forward to, it does help us with our appropriation and our handling of the book. Now, it's also helpful to know that the book is, by and large, an account of visions that are held by a singular figure. The John of this text, it's been debated since the mid-1st and 2nd century, who it is that actually wrote this. You have some early scholars like Justin Martyr, who was worked really hard to try to make Christianity respectable to well-educated pagan philosophers, people influenced by that, and was ultimately martyred for his efforts, which is why we call him Justin Martyr, writing around 150-ish, to Papias in the late 2nd century, who we've encountered a few different times, who were pretty sure that this was John the disciple, the same one who's the beloved disciple of the character in the 4th gospel. Whereas others, notably Eusebius and Tertullian and some others, argued for a second figure, John the Elder, who is a local church leader in Asia Minor that we don't really know very much about, and yet either one is a sensible choice. If you notice in the first, and we don't really know, who it could be some other anonymous Christian borrowing the name John because it was a known name, or it could be somebody else that we don't really know about. But that debate has been lively, and it's been going on for many, many centuries, from the 2nd century on to today. Different people have felt different ways about this book. It's placed at the back of the canon, and certainly was placed that way and left there in translating decisions because people are a little iffy about the book. Martin Luther, for example, who started the Protestant Reformation, hated this book almost as much as he hated the book of James, and didn't believe there was any inspiration from the Holy Spirit in it at all. So he was really hard on it, whereas others have held to the book as a source of great hope and great strength in difficult times. So I would just tell you, sorry about the background noise, I'm traveling for the university and it sounds a little crazy behind me here. Look at it in that sense of looking for hope and an unveiling of what's really going on behind the scenes, with an angle to hanging on for the ultimate redemption that's to come. So that's really what's going on here, and we'll talk a little bit in the next video section about the structure of the book and some of the primary symbols.